Welcome to Firstline, I'm Daniel Pizarro. The Reserve Bank of Australia officially lowered interest rates this week for the first time in many years. Since November 2023, the cash rate has been sitting at 4.35%. Now it's down 0.25% to 4.1%. So what does this mean for homeowners and the federal government, especially with an election expected to be called any minute now? Earlier this week, I spoke to Dr. Daniel Kiley from the Bank West Coast Economics Centre in Perth. Well, first, Dr. Kiley, thank you very much for joining me today. First question, were you surprised that the RBA decided to cut interest rates? Because there was a lot of speculation about what the RBA would or wouldn't do, but it turns out they had decided to cut the rate by 0.25%. It's the first time we've had such an interest rate cut in several years.
Yeah, that's right, Daniel. And look, I think a lot of economists were expecting a rate cut in the nature of what we saw, the 25 basis points or 0.25%. To be honest, I was a bit on the fence. I wouldn't have been surprised if they had held the interest rate as it was. We still see underlying inflation sitting at 3.2%, which is outside the RBA's target band of between 2 and 3%. Of course, inflation or CPI is at 2.4%, which is positive. But as I said, that trimmed or underlying inflation remains outside of that 2 to 3% band. And that trimmed mean it excludes some very volatile items, which could be causing that the CPI to sit at 2.4%. So again, a lot of people look more so at that underlying inflation rate, which again, as I said, is at 3.2% above the target inflation rate.
Now, the RBA had said in their statement as soon as the rate cut was announced that they are happy with how inflation has been declining, but they have warned of other factors as well, such as economic growth is still relatively weak. They're also concerned about the tightness of the labour market, as well as external factors, including international events. What is your take on what the RBA had said?
Yeah, look, there was certainly a word of caution there in terms of expectations around future rate cuts. They were very firm in their wording around not to expect future rate cuts, because again, it is very much a watch and wait and see in terms of what future data comes out with around inflation and CPI. The next quarterly CPI release comes towards the end of April, and there'll be a lot of eyes watching that one. As you say, the labour market is remaining very strong. Unemployment rates remain low, and there's a tightness in the labour market. So we're still seeing, increases in employment. We are seeing a shortage of workers across many sectors of the economy. And there's a worry there from the RBA, and they've signalled this around the fear that this tight labour market could lead to further wage pressures, which in turn could lead to further inflationary pressures. So again, they're very much saying, the interest rate that now exists is still a restrictive one, and there's no guarantee of further rate cuts in the near future.
You mentioned that we had these inflationary pressures. I know that the RBA was, of course, very concerned for quite a while about inflation being too high. What are some of the driving forces for that inflation? I know that there was concerns over things like government spending as being a contributing factor.
Yeah, look, there's a lot of factors at play here. Obviously, on the back of the COVID-19 pandemic and the supply chain issues that emerged as a result of that, border closures, factories impacted in the likes of China and other areas, we saw that supply chain disruption very much impacting inflationary pressures. So there was very much a supply side element to it. We are seeing the demand side also strong, where again, with a strong labour market, you are seeing activity remaining there despite the high inflation rates. But many households are finding it hard. There are cost of living pressures. As you say, government spending, that's actually been a really important part of our economic growth of late. It's been an important factor to keep us out of negative territory in terms of our growth across the national economy. But consumer spending, business investment has remained reasonably weak. And therefore, again, with the drop in interest rates, the RBA will be hoping that we'll see some pickup in terms of consumer confidence, business confidence, and perhaps again see those as further drivers of economic growth across the economy.
I know also that international factors can be very much out of our control. We currently, of course, have the war in Ukraine continuing to have a major impact on so many of Australia's imports and exports, as well as our business and trading partners. We also have the uncertainties to a degree about what the United States is doing regarding tariffs and the rhetoric from US President Donald Trump, and then you throw in potential trade wars involving China and all these other factors that can combine to create a lot of uncertainty in the world market. Do you think that could also have a potential effect on the Australian economy and possibly on our cost of living and interest rates?
Look, absolutely. Again, I think we're all watching with a very careful eye, particularly the trade wars and the impact that they will have. There may be some direct impacts through direct tariffs that are placed on the Australian economy and exports from Australia, but also the indirect effect. If there's a slowdown in the Chinese economy because of tariffs placed on Chinese exports, to what extent will that impact the Australian economy? To what extent will it impact iron ore prices, for example, will be something that will be very closely watched. And again, the RBA signaled to this as well in their announcement today. They're very careful to say that there's a lot of uncertainties within our economy, these trade tariffs being one of those, and the impact that they will have. It will take some time yet to see how that fully plays out and takes effect across the economy. But again, it's a reason why the RBA are cautious here. It's a very slight decrease in the overall cash rate. It is some relief to households, but in the context of the 13 increases in the cash rate that we've seen over the last number of years, it's a very slight relief to households, and that's not going to dramatically change people's circumstances.
And it's interesting, when I looked at how interest rates had been since the early 90s, of course, we had the rather infamous 17% and going back to the 1970s, 20s and 24% and all that. And I remember that many years ago, interest rates of about 6 or 5% was considered low. But now, taking into the factors of our increased cost of living, the COVID-19 pandemic, an interest rate of 4.35% was quite pressing on a lot of households. And it does show how different the world has been over the past few decades, considering that what used to be considered a relatively low interest rate is now considered quite high. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, look, I think that's absolutely a fair point. In historical context, yes, cash rate is relatively low. But again, you've got to keep in mind the context, as you say there, that, before we saw these rate rises, the cash rate was effectively almost 0%. Okay. So, the impact and the shock it had on households, those increases, was quite substantial. And it takes households time to adjust their expenditure patterns and change behavior to be able to meet those additional mortgage repayments then and change consumer behavior, which is why we also saw, for example, savings rates go down significantly on the back of the COVID-19 pandemic, where again, during COVID, people actually saved quite a lot because they weren't able to spend as much with border closures and lockdowns. So saving rates increased, but we saw savings rates go down quite substantially in the last couple of years. So again, households have been feeling the pinch, have been dipping into their savings in order to maintain living standards. I guess back to your point as well, central bank policy and monetary policy has changed, particularly where central banks have started to target inflation and set target rates of between 2 and 3%. And that's been quite successful. And in turn, you've seen less of this massive variations in interest rates as well, because of the success of some of that monetary policy.
Now, the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, said today that the worst is now behind us, and he was going for this soft landing, which many treasurers and governments always hope that they would have. As you would know, Ireland, of course, was usually tried to aim for that soft landing, but then they fell through the floor and I think down to the core of the earth in the 2000s under Taoiseach Brian Cowan. And at the moment, Jim Chalmers seems very confident that things are going to go quite well. Do you think that the worst is now behind us?
Certainly in terms of the high inflation rates that we've seen, on the back of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think it's unlikely that we'll return to anything like that in the near future. Michelle Bullock, the governor of the RBA, was very, very clear to say it's very hard to predict the future, and particularly when you go beyond 6 to 12 months, it's very hard to see what will happen, and there's a lot of uncertainties that can happen. Certainly the trade wars, the global uncertainties there, as you say, the crisis in Ukraine, the continued crisis there, Middle East uncertainties, these will all be weighing on governments' minds. They are creating uncertainties in markets. And, again, it's very hard to predict the future, but I do think that the RBA has done a good job in containing inflation and bringing it back down to what are reasonable levels. We've been very fortunate here in Australia that the labour market has remained strong despite the high inflation rates, despite the increase in interest rates. Labour market has remained strong. But we do need to shift away somewhat from a reliance on public expenditure to maintain economic growth. And the RBA again signaled that they want to see household consumption, business investment, that private sector starting to drive more of the economic growth across the economy, and that's really important.
And how do you think Tuesday's decision will impact the upcoming federal election campaign? There was that speculation that if rates had been put on hold or even risen for whatever reason, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese would delay the election till May. But now that we've had this cut, there is that analysis that he might decide to visit the Governor-General within a matter of weeks, and we could go to the polls around mid-April. What kind of impact do you think this could have?
Look, again, obviously the RBA is an independent entity and would have made this decision solely on the basis of the economics of it and what made good economic sense given the data that they had at hand. Of course, as you say, this may lead to an earlier election because, again, from a political perspective, some will play this as, the success of government in playing a role to bring inflation back in to within its target rate, whilst, again, the labour market has remained strong. There are some success stories there that could be played out in the political economy situation. And as you say, as a result, you could see an earlier election being called there. The Treasurer did as well mention in his speech today about the budget, and it'll be interesting to see what emerges in that, particularly in a pre-election sense.
Doctor, thank you so much for your time.
No problem. Thank you.
Dr. Daniel Kiley from the Bankwest Curtin Economic Centre in WA there. The city of Whyalla in South Australia is celebrating after the state government placed the Whyalla Steelworks into administration. It follows months of controversy surrounding its operator, GFG, who reportedly owe hundreds of millions of dollars to suppliers. The federal government has also stepped in, offering to bail out the steelworks to the tune of $2.4 billion, of which not 1 cent will go to GFG. To discuss the situation, I'm joined from Whyalla by the city's mayor, Paul Stone. Mayor Stone, I can imagine that the past couple of days, and as we will talk off air, the past couple of months have been very concerning and in many ways confusing for not just council but also the people of Whyalla and in fact the whole state of South Australia. Given the fact now that the South Australian government has placed the steelworks into administration and within 15 minutes of legislation being introduced, first, what is the feeling going around town at the moment?
Absolutely uplifted. The morale has just gone up. The morale in Whyalla for a long time now has just been going down further and further, not knowing what the future holds with the issues with GFG. I spoke to a worker yesterday at the spoke to creditors yesterday, and they were in awe. They were in rapture. This group of creditors owed a lot of money, sitting around, chatting, smiling, knowing that things were now going to change. The way that this has been orchestrated by the government, I really do give them credit, our Premier and then our Prime Minister. They've both been working together on this to identify a way forward. It had to go forward. The confidence in the owner by the community, by the workers, by the governments had been lost. And the fact that there was nothing in sight, genuinely, that they would be out of the issues, that people were still being asked to work and not being paid. And we've got local contractors, we had job losses. Then contractors were losing contracts. Huge potential for it to ultimately go into administration without government involvement, and you would hate to think the results there. The way it's been done, and we now know, I was fortunate. We had regular updates from the government confidentially about how it was going. We were advocating very much, and I had many conversations with the Premier and Minister Kusantonis during this period with how the city was feeling. But they knew how it was going. They were here regularly seeing it. They weren't doing it from a laptop in Adelaide. They were here on the ground, had many meetings with people. But the whole feeling of the city, the way it's been done and how it's been explained by the Premier and the Prime Minister, has reassured everyone that things are about to change. Sure, it's still going to be a big journey. Still lots of questions to be answered and the fine print and everybody understanding exactly. But the initial announcement from the Premier that contractors will now be paid, creditors will be paid. If you do a job next week, you will be paid next week for the work. And so that has been an incredible reassurance to the workers, to the unions, to business, because it's not just the 2,000 or so people that either work or depend on the steelworks. Everybody in Whyalla, when things go tough at a steelworks, they suffer. The lunch shop is selling fewer lunches. Us Aussies, we drive on our coffee these days, and it's got to be from a coffee shop. None of this instant coffee in your own kitchen anymore. Less cups of coffee being sold. So those sorts of lunch shops have gone from, say, 2 to 1.5 staff, or even less. If they've got half a dozen staff, they've cut them in half. So they're not people working at the steelworks. But one thing that COVID is responsible for is all governments of all persuasions realising how fragile we can be in Australia when our supplies are cut off. Because Whyalla produces 75%, and I think it's even more than that, the structural steel that goes into bridges, buildings, comes from Whyalla. And we do produce, call me biased, but we produce the best steel in the world. Far better than cheap overseas steel that unfortunately at times, I'm not supposed to use the word dumped, but seems to get here in large quantities. So it was seen essential. Some people have said, well, yesterday, is this just a bailout for GFG? No way. GFG don't see a single dollar of this $2.4 billion. I describe it, for us in Whyalla, that is eye-watering, $2.4 billion investment. And the governments are seeing it as an investment to get people back to work now, to stabilise the steelworks and ensure the essential maintenance that needs to be done is done, and then work with a new buyer with 1.9 billion that they will invest with a buyer, and it will be run their way, not just all handed over. Now go to it, guys. So that the governments will have a strong interest in the future to ensure it does stand up. And that is vastly different to when the steelworks went in under Arium, when they went bust 8-9 years ago. Vastly different. Governments weren't involved. There were no strings attached. Arium found a buyer. The buyer bought it. The buyer was going to do this, that, and the other. Unfortunately, didn't eventuate. This is vastly different, and I've got all the confidence in the world. Having worked in our small way in Whyalla with the Premier and many discussions with him, I have every confidence. When I'm asked, well, is this still going to be going in 5 or 10 years? You bet your life it is. To see a city I can't help but say this, to see a city that's so excited about a company going to administration is just incredible. Very unfortunate that it had to end up this way, but there were very, very real fears that things would just get worse and may not be able to be recovered. So, yeah, everybody, Daniel, is pretty happy.
When, in your opinion, did you become aware that things were starting to go wrong under the GFG management? Because when I was in Whyalla, of course, when the Premier was there in early 2023, there was this massive event with footy stars. We had the Premier, we had the GFG management, we had yourself there. There was a huge amount of excitement about green steel and the whole renewable aspects that the steelworks was going through, and that this company would be investing tremendous amounts of money. Reopening the steelworks, of course, was a great exciting event, as well as all this other renewable energy that was happening in Port Pirie and Port Augusta, as well as Broken Hill. Where did it all go wrong?
If I look at it from my perspective, 12 months ago, I guess there were definite concerns. Nothing is happening that should be happening. Some of the promises about the getting an arc furnace in, when it's going to be up and running, we could see that those schedules and those announcements, nothing was happening. So I would say at least 12 months ago, there were some red flags going up, but there was the assurance at that stage that funding is being organised. Yes, it will happen. So at that stage, I think there was a lot of faith put in Mr. Gupta with what he was saying. But as things went on, you could see less maintenance was being done. There was cost saving in certain areas. And when you start hearing stories negatively from workers that should know what's going on, I think a few more red flags were going up. But then at that stage, the blast furnace issue. So anything else lost focus while they were trying to get the blast furnace back up and running. A lot of concern then because it was going on so long. They'd start, then they'd go backwards. Morale certainly went down then. Well, what if the blast furnace can't get back online? You don't have a blast furnace, you don't have a steel industry. You take away a steel industry from Whyalla, do you have Whyalla? It's as basic as that, because people, I guess also from the eastern states, far abroad, that don't really know what happens in Whyalla. While we've got other industries, Whyalla is here because of mining and steelmaking. Without that, we've got issues. And so it was really pleasing news that the blast furnace came back online, but then the ongoing issues, the lack of advancement on some of the promises made, a lot of information. Yes, we're on top of this. So I guess to cut a long story short, it was gradually growing and there was concern. And of course, even our community right now, they're saying, oh, what happened yesterday should have happened 4 or 5 months ago. Well, to do what happened yesterday and Wednesday is you don't just do overnight. There's got to be a lot of planning, a lot of work behind the scenes, because although people are just saying, look, kick the owner out, take it over and nationalise it, it's not that easy. And so I would have, now that I know how the government did it and how much time went into the planning, I can understand why they had to choose the right timing. The owner probably is not very happy about it. We as a city and we as a council, were doing our most to support him for as long as we thought things were going okay. But then you had to move away and think, no, this is not good for our community. There has to be another way, and the only other way is through government.
We're looking at what the government has been doing, both state and federal. First, we do have the SA government has placed the steelworks into administration, with Corthamenta being the administrators, and they will look for a buyer. We also have over $2.4 billion announced by the federal government and the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese as a package, not just for the steelworks itself, but also for the personnel. To my understanding, there are going at the moment no job losses, and that the Steelworks is going to be still operating. Is that correct?
Most definitely. The way they've done the packages. In fact, Wednesday, before the big announcement here, I had a phone call from the administrator who was in the car on his way to Whyalla, looking forward to catching up with council, meeting with us, and to see where we can fit into the equation as well. So look, work was starting before I think probably it was all official. And the Premier went to great pains to tell contractors and creditors that part of their package, their initial package, I think the first package is about 100 million, there is money in there specifically to pay out creditors. A little bit of paperwork for everybody to do, but it will be there. None of this, oh, yes, put it in and we'll get around to it. He is adamant. You get your paperwork done, you get it in, you will get paid. And that there will be no job losses. They've been very clear on that. And the aim is, obviously, now that it's under administration, to get it back on track and actually start taking on more employees, because obviously there's been quite a few that have gone either voluntarily or otherwise. Since all the problems started, there's going to be a lot of maintenance needed. So there's going to be a lot of work for contractors to come back on to site, which will be fantastic.
We know that one of the big things that for the steelworks, as well as the Iron Triangle in general, has been the use of green steel, as well as blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, other renewables, and more environmentally friendly and more technologically advanced ideas. We've seen all the projects happening around Port Augusta and Port Pirie. What do you think could be the future for Whyalla? Is green steel part of that future? Or do you think that it will have to be something else?
I think green steel is certainly part of the future. The first priority will be to get the business back up and running. I would imagine to be turning out as much steel as possible. And then once they get a new buyer, I would see the government and the new buyer sitting down and looking at the future, because that is one of the reasons that 1.9 billion, I mean, for us to be talking about that in Whyalla, hey, that's a big bag of money, Daniel. And that will, I would imagine that it would be all part of the government's plan, that they got the new buyer, new owner, they will talk turkey about the future, what investment they will expect from the new owner and the investment they're putting in, because steelworks are still going that way by necessity into green steel. So I think you'll find that still on the cards, most definitely. Not continuing blast furnace technology. Look, that was great when it was first invented. The world has had to move on. The world's got to change. So I would imagine the green steel changing to electric arc. I'm pretty sure both the Prime Minister and the Premier have used that in some of their speeches, that's what they'll still be looking at, because that's the way it has to go.
And has there been any potential time frame? Has the Premier or the Prime Minister said about, or the administrators themselves asked about how long they are potentially looking for a buyer while the company is under administration?
Not publicly. They might have that privately, which I'm not aware of. The Premier did say that last time it was under administration, that was for about 17 months. Hopefully this one, because it's a different outcome, won't be that long. But no timelines have been given other than administrators on site. They started as soon as they got here, liaising with creditors. So things will certainly be happening from right now, and it will just keep going.
And as you mentioned earlier, the steel from Whyalla is exported interstate. So we have, of course, steel refineries here in Tamworth, and we know the importance of, as you mentioned, all the construction projects. If the steelworks, for whatever reason, was to be shut down, we know, of course, the devastating effects that would have on Whyalla in South Australia. But what kind of effects could that have on places that import steel like Tamworth?
Daniel, that's not in my vocabulary to answer a hypothetical question. If the steelworks closed down, it will not close down. End of story. No question to answer there.
That's certainly good to know. And how has you as Mayor and the Council been reacting to the events over the next few days? It's, as you mentioned, it's quite unusual for there to be applause and excitement among locals for a company to be put into administration. And we even have the possibility that the federal government might look at buying a stake in the steelworks itself.
Oh, I hadn't heard that one, but hey, a dollar's a dollar, wherever it comes from. But I think the important thing is that both governments recognise the importance of Whyalla and Whyalla Steel, not just for Whyalla and South Australia, but the nation, the significance there. Also, you can't let a city, we're still a city, we are a city, countrified town, I call us. We don't have traffic jams. I always say a traffic jam here is actually having to stop at the traffic lights. Great lifestyle, great people. Yes, Whyalla's got that tag for being, well, we've been resilient. Gets a bit overused at time. Even before this announcement, there was still positivity, look, we'll get over it, but there was only a handful of people that were really thinking we would get over it without government intervention. And the intervention is just perfect. Regrettably, it had to be done. Normally, you like to see a business trade out of its issues, because I know one of the things both governments were very concerned about is that if they put a company into administration, the unintentional consequences, you often got to be careful what you ask for, that there might be an outcome you don't like. I think that is also one of the reasons this has probably taken a little bit longer than some people would have liked to come up with this, but to come up with something that will work and will have the minimal negative impact on the community. And what has been delivered so far and announced, it's just got everybody really, really flying high. It is a great way to end a week, particularly, Daniel, after the last crazy days in Whyalla. It was people asked me yesterday, how did I feel when the Premier made the announcement? And we were watching it in the CEO's office, the TV of it. And we all just had this weird feeling. This is something earth-shattering that we've been expecting. I believed it was coming very, very, very soon. The suddenness and the speed really took me by surprise. I believed it was just around the corner. But that first feeling, I've talked to others about this, and it was just like some major, is this really happening? And even some of the workers were saying they've got to pinch themselves, this is correct. And again, talking to some of the workers as well as the creditors at the announcement at the Steelworks yesterday, the workers have got that extra spring in their step because they can now see things happening that they're worried about, the maintenance coming back. So everybody, I know there would have been a pub in Whyalla last night that would have done some extra business with a fair bit of celebration while I'm home in my recliner trying to stay awake to watch the news.
Mayor Phil Stone, thank you so much for joining us.
Look at the smile. Yeah, you haven't seen this for a long, long time. It is a pleasure after what I've had to go through and others with the speculation leading up to this. And of course, when GFG weren't putting much information out and we knew things were going bad, good old Mayor of Whyalla, he'll know everything and he'll tell us everything. Well, he doesn't always know everything, and sometimes he can't tell you everything. But although yesterday was thank goodness the day's over type day, it was a pleasure to be able to talk positively without straddling that very sharp picket fence. So it's a long time that you haven't seen so many of these in Whyalla. So it is It is good news. Yeah, still a lot of work ahead, but now the whole town, the whole city, the government, everyone can move forward and really look forward to the future now.
Mayor of Whyalla, Phil Stone there. Heading overseas, and the country of Argentina has been plunged into a political crisis after the country's president, Javier Milei, was caught up in a cryptocurrency scam. The president had promoted a little-known coin called Libra to his millions of followers on Twitter. Within hours, the coin's value skyrocketed, then collapsed. Now hundreds of millions of dollars is missing, with many of Milei's supporters buying up that coin and losing a fortune. To make matters worse for the president, the opposition is now calling for his impeachment, and an investigation into his conduct is now underway. Joining me from Patagonia is Donnie McClurkin, adjunct professor for the University of Technology, Sydney. Professor McClurkin, thank you very much for joining me. I will have to say that the past couple of days in Argentinian politics have certainly raised the bar when it comes to how crazy the situation is. We have the President Javier Milei now engulfed in this crypto scandal. When you started hearing about it, what was going through your head? Because this has now caused a massive scandal, and over $100 million has now vanished, essentially.
Yeah, Daniel, this is a really interesting scenario. Interesting in particular because of the kind of campaign that Javier Milei ran, the kind of government he's been trying to run, and this CryptoGate scandal that has emerged has essentially affected, in terms of losses, the very people who are at the base of his supportership. And so it's an unusual thing because I think it probably even has taken the president by surprise at just how much this has blown up. Obviously, he wasn't anticipating this kind of pump and dump reality, perhaps, in its full sense, although perhaps he did understand some of the dynamics behind things. But just how big this is it's unraveling by the day, and it seems to be getting bigger and bigger.
And this is a classic pump and dump scam, as you just mentioned. We've had, of course, that infamous Hawk Tour girl who's been involved in that pump and dump scam. Many YouTube and other influencers have also done it, and even Donald Trump has been accused of being involved. But the fact of the matter is, what surprises me really is that Javier Milei, he is an economist, and he has been at least meeting with people who have been involved in cryptocurrencies, including this lot that was responsible for this Libra coin. It just seems absolutely insane that he would be involved in something like this.
You're absolutely right, Daniel. I mean, when Javier Milei met with Hayden Davis in January 30th, he came out of that meeting, from what I understand, buoyed by new information about blockchain, about AI, and the possibilities. And this is part of a longer history of the Milei presidency, both in its campaigning stages and in its practice, really gripping on to cryptocurrency, right? As part of this anarcho-capitalist kind of approach, libertarian, viva la libertad, as they say here, this idea that freedom and cryptocurrency go hand in hand. And I think there's also an interesting dimension here that's been brought up by many commentators of, is this an echo of what Donald Trump did in the US and Melania Trump did with the launch of their meme coins as well, right? Where we saw not maybe this nearly the same kind of dramatic losses, but absolutely significant losses for a lot of day traders, speculators, people who get pulled in without a lot of knowledge around these things, but are sort of struck by the aura of these presidencies and what might be possible in terms of speculation and in meme coins, things that have essentially no functional value.
And I know that because we've had many of these schemes, I have a personal observation that even if these people who are investing know that they're going to be involved in a potential pump and dump scheme, they're wanting to get in as quickly as possible, buy up the coin at that high value and then try and sell it off. But often, because these coins are controlled by just a select few insiders, those people who think, oh, I'm going to get in and then get out, they're going to lose. And we've seen on Twitter, unverified, but quite impressively, a lot of people have claimed that they've invested their life savings or several $1 million into this. And it just seems that it's the same thing over and over again, that this is not like that you're playing against the house, where like in gambling or anything. The fact of the matter is that the crypto people who control that coin will always win.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Daniel. The numbers I've been reading are up to 400 million Australian dollars of losses here. And just as in the share market, in some ways, there's some similarities. We see that whenever you have incredible volatility, it's the day traders, it's the speculators, it's the people who are in with small amounts hoping to make it big who suffer, because the second that that drop starts, that precipice in the price, and in this case, we're talking about it coming down from almost 8 Australian dollars, all 90% losses within a couple of hours. What happens is that the people who, even if, as you said, they might have some information about blockchain or investing, these sorts of things, they freak out, because to non-institutional investors, we're talking about life savings, as you said. I mean, I've seen TikTok videos of people screaming, who were supporters of Javier Milei, screaming, saying, "I'm going to come and find you," like that kind of thing. Perhaps not to the president himself, of course, but to the people who might have been behind some of this investment offering. And investment offering, I should say, in quotes, because as mentioned, like, we're not talking about anything here for any of the listeners or people watching. We're not talking about something that has any value. We're talking about a meme coin, something that, I mean, that they're commonly referred to or adjacent to shit coins, right? So that we're not talking about things that have substance in the real world in terms of value that you can tie it to. We're talking about things that are just speculative on the basis of internet memes or cult personalities, etc. And so you're right, Daniel. The problem here is that at the end of the day, when we talk about that possibly $400 million of losses, that means that there's 400 million Australian dollars of gains somewhere. And where are those gains? They will be in the institutions that are behind these coins that, as you said, hold the majority of the stake in the meme coin. And that's where we get into the nefarious territory, because there's clear understanding of people whenever I mean, no one can be so naive, no matter whether you want to talk about this being an economic opportunity, as Javier Milei tried to describe it. No one can be as naive as to think that when a president of a country encourages by resharing a tweet, that isn't going to jack the price up. And when there's no substance behind something, that's a very dangerous place to be playing in.
Not to mention, he gave this interview on television the other day, and he just said, "Oh, I was posting this from my personal account," which I find is an absolutely incredulous answer, because this is an account that goes out to millions of followers, and this is your personal account of the President of Argentina. And I also love the fact that he did post earlier that I didn't understand the details of this project. We know, as you said, he met with these people already, and he has been big into cryptocurrency, and he is an economist, and he is the president of Argentina, whose economic policies have been one of the big driving forces for him to be elected. The fact that he's trying to wipe away any and absolve himself of any responsibility, it's just absolutely staggering. I cannot believe what I'm seeing, and I can't imagine what the reaction is that you're seeing in Argentina.
I think you're right, Daniel. I think that Javier Milei knew what he was getting into, but maybe didn't understand the scope of the possible risk for his presidency. And as I mentioned before, it's particularly interesting and risky because the people who are losing from this in Argentina are from his support base, right? These are people who believe in this idea of freedom without caps. He's been promoting, the same kind of model that we're now seeing play out in the US, that has a close connection with libertarianism, with this notion of like hands off for the government. Cryptocurrency, for those who may be unfamiliar, is a very strong ideological and practical thing in Argentina because of significant inflation over so many years, 100+% of inflation still in this country year on year. You have the parallel markets here in terms of currencies, and then you have cryptocurrency as a space that people have historically, through Bitcoin in particular, seen a store of value in an economy that is incredibly volatile. But now you upend that. You take something that was largely seen because, for example, a 20% difference in a cryptocurrency here doesn't mean as much as it does in the US, because when you've got 170% inflation, 20% doesn't seem so big. So there was stability in crypto in Argentina. Not anymore. This changes the game. We now, I suspect, are going to see, in addition to the legal battles and the impeachment processes that have been floated and may possibly emerge, whether or not it would lead to anything is another question. What we will probably see now is a growing distrust of the Solaris network and other spaces where the blockchain is operating out of, and these kinds of meme coins. There's going to be a once bitten, twice shy approach, but what effect that has politically will be interesting, especially with the midterms coming up later this year.
And one of the big things, of course, is that the president's approval ratings were wax and wanes, as they typically do, but he was definitely on track to get more people from his party in for these midterm elections. But looking at the opinion polls, he has been fighting with the traditional Peronist forces, but now we know that this could be an absolutely damaging scandal for him, to the point where we do know that there are some opposition members who are calling for his impeachment.
You're absolutely right, Daniel. Whether or not this will have an effect on the midterms such that there's no doubt in my mind that we're going to see more of the party that Javier Milei has been leading. We're going to see more seats. But for those who aren't familiar, they hold a very small number. They've had to form coalition with the PRO party, headed up by the former president under Mauricio Macri. This situation, though, it may not change the ultimate outcome in terms of his party getting more seats, but it may change the election outcome in terms of the PRO and the coalition. Why? Because just today, Mauricio Macri, the former president, came out and said something that I was surprised to see. From what I could understand of the translation, he was talking about this damaging the credibility of Argentina. Now, here you have like a coalition that is very pragmatic at the moment. The fact that you would have someone in such a strong leadership capability or position come and speak out so publicly is surprising to me. I wasn't expecting that from former President Macri. So we'll see what this does. I don't think that it's likely, given the Peronist parties don't have the majority in the lower house or the Senate. I think it's unlikely here that we will see an effective impeachment process. What I think is more interesting is what this does in terms of the trust from his base. And what I have sensed historically from observing some of these kinds of things is that these kinds of scandals don't go alone. What will happen is over the next 6 months, we've now got an opening, I think, where the fallibility of President Milei in the eyes of certain people has changed. Right? There were certain things that have happened before today that people have been willing to sort of take a glance away from. This may change the game in terms of those scandals emerging down the track, landing in a different kind of way with a particular part of the electorate.
And we know how volatile the Argentinian economy can be. After this scandal happened, I know the Buenos Aires Stock Exchange fell 4% on opening trade, which is a clear signal that there is a big concern about economic confidence. You and I know that Argentina has gone through so many economic crises, all the way dating back to the late 1980s and even before then, but we also had the presidencies of Carlos Menem and then the Argentinian economic crisis of 2001, followed by the global financial crisis, and then, of course, President Milei's predecessor, Fernandez, where we had inflation well over 200%. How stable is the Argentinian economy, given that we've now just had a 4% decline just from what essentially has amounted to a single tweet, but now hundreds of millions of dollars vanishing?
It's a good question, Daniel. I maybe am a little more optimistic in that sense because, as you may know, the stock market bounced back within 24 hours. And so, but I think what it symbolizes is interesting, right? So I think that ultimately there's a stability that still underlies Argentinian stocks. I think despite my own personal views on what's happening with the Milei presidency in terms of the economics of it. I know there's a lot of investment confidence from many circles, and he's been doing a lot of tours to the US and other places to drum up some of that investment. And by, I think, objective accounts, the conversations with the IMF are proceeding in a way that President Milei would have been happy with. Whether or not that makes a difference in terms of the lives of Argentinians, I have great questions. I think that there still remains a very extractive experience that's happening in Argentina, where money continues to pour out of the country. And I think that the future of lending to this country is going to probably exacerbate that. So whether or not these kinds of things expose sort of deeper risk in the economy, I'm not so convinced. But what I do think they do is I think that they show people that there is a fallibility to someone who is an economist, as you pointed out, right? To have an economist making a problematic retweet of something like this, being wrapped up in a scandal that's now extended to his sister, Karina, who is his chief of staff, who's implicated in this as well. This is the destabilizing piece more so than the economics. I mean, the amount of money we're talking about here and the scale of the Argentinian economy is small, but what it symbolizes in terms of this is no longer a president who people are going to see fully as invincible when it comes to economic decision making.
And we know that he has launched his own investigation through the Department of the Presidency. But of course, that is a little bit cynical that the president is essentially investigating himself in this whole matter. And I know that there's a lot of cynicism from a lot of Argentinian commentators after this investigation was announced. What do you think we could possibly see as any consequences or any type of political or legislative reform? Because I know one of the biggest problems with cryptocurrency is the fact that its greatest strength in many ways is its weakness. That unregulated aspect makes it in many ways very difficult to track money, as well as how easy it is for people to fall into so many of these different scams.
Look, I think that it's unlikely we're going to see any kind of criminal repercussions of any serious nature, or indeed seeing like a strengthening of regulatory regimes around this. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, if Javier Milei is not seeing somewhat similar schemes in the US lead to, big uproars, which didn't happen in the US in the same kind of way that this scandal is unfolding, I think Milei is taking his lead from the US and seeing what he can get away with. And whether or not that's appropriate or applicable, we will see. What I think is more going to be interesting here is how long this runs in terms of the news cycle and the court of public opinion. I'm surprised because Milei has so far done a very good job of breaking the news cycle with other kinds of controversies, etc., whether it's stories about kids that have been potentially trafficked, etc., that have gripped the nation, or the scandals associated with former President Fernandez. There have been lots of ways that the news cycle has been broken up. But we're now, Tuesday here? We're now 4 days in since this, and it's still front page. That's interesting. So we'll see how long this story runs. And I think it's the court of public opinion that's going to be the biggest toll that the Milei presidency will probably see in terms of the impact this may have. But there's other avenues that are being explored. And we'll see, especially interesting when former President Macri talks about an investigation being needed. That's unusual. And so that may lead to some bipartisanship that might be unexpected, but would certainly be some interesting fireworks in Buenos Aires.
And I guess looking at the current situation with so many of Argentinian presidents, as you just inferred to, Alberto Fernandez has been investigated for alleged domestic violence against his wife. We know that Cristina de Kirchner has been, of course, under a shadow of corruption. And if you go even back further, Carlos Menem was jailed for embezzlement and financial fraud and all these aspects. So the whole like prevalence of corruption and mismanagement in the economy is something that has been long withstanding in Argentina, and we've seen this happen time and time again. And then you have Javier Milei coming in, being like the outsider and doing what he was doing by cutting all these costs and doing all this anarcho-capitalist stuff, and then being involved in a potential corruption scandal himself. This just shows like there seems to be something really rotten within the state of Argentina.
Well, you talk to any Argentinian here, and I think that there's common agreement that the reason that Javier Milei is in power now is in big part because people were just so tired of what you're describing, the party politics, and he played to this idea, as I think you've seen in the US as well with President Trump, this idea of draining the swamp, right? The challenge is one of the challenges is when you have that narrative and then people start to see you as part of the very thing that you campaigned against, then some people are, bulletproof in certain ways, as we've seen with the US presidency. But I don't think the Argentinians are in a similar kind of boat. Why? Because many of the things that we're seeing with President Milei echo what we saw under Menem's presidency. And so there's like a deep awareness of what people don't want, all the way through to the corralito, where money that people had in accounts was essentially cashed in for very small amounts of pesos in sort of a bail-in process associated with the country's bankruptcy. And so we have a history here that's different, right? The US, I'm often comparing to the US because there are a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of differences. And so I think there's a moment in which the Argentinian people will say no to certain things that's different to what might be happening in the US. But we get to see. We get to see. It's definitely, we're moving into uncharted territory. And I mean, the whole of Milei's presidency has been uncharted, but this is uncharted in the sense of now is there sort of a sense of the hypocrisy that perhaps sits underneath some of these things. Whether or not it moves through to corruption, I'm not sure. Whether or not it plays into people's sense of the corrupt caste, as Milei has often been critiquing, we'll see. But I think that it's new territory, and probably over the next week we're going to. My sense is there's going to be more of this story to unravel yet.
Professor McClurkin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Daniel.
Donnie McClurkin, adjunct professor from the University of Technology, speaking from Patagonia. And that is Firstline for now. I'm Daniel Pizarro. Thank you so much for your company. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you soon.